What happened when you had to leave your country? We're moving back to the Philippines next month, my dad said at dinner, and his voice cracked like he might cry. They'd immigrated here when I was a baby, and I'd never lived anywhere but California since. I barely spoke Tagalog, but he said we didn't have a choice because his company was going under and we couldn't stay without his job. Mom stared at her plate while tears dropped onto her rice, and my little sister ran to her room sobbing about leaving her friends. I sat there looking at the Stanford acceptance letter on the counter that suddenly meant nothing, while Dad kept apologizing over and over, saying he'd failed us. The Manila airport was a wall of humid air and voices speaking too fast for me to follow, even though everyone looked like me. My cousin laughed when I tried to order food at the market and accidentally asked for fish intestines instead of rice because I got the tones wrong. "American girl doesn't know her own language," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. I spent the first month at my aunt's house feeling like a tourist in my own family. The local public school was nothing like Sacramento, where I was valedictorian. Kids switched between English and Tagalog mid-sentence, and I got headaches trying to keep up. At lunch, I sat alone reading books I'd brought from home until the pages warped from humidity, while everyone called me the American, like it was a joke. Then one girl dropped into the seat next to me and said she'd teach me real Tagalog if I helped her with college essays for American schools. "We'll start with the curse words because that's how you actually learn," she said, grinning. Every day after school, she taught me phrases my parents never bothered with while I fixed her grammar and explained why Americans cared so much about extracurriculars. Her friends started joining us, and they were nothing like the Filipino kids at my California school, who had panic attacks over SAT scores. These kids made music on broken guitars and painted murals on abandoned buildings without caring if it would look good on college applications. Nobody asked what my parents did for work or what my 5-year plan was. 6 months in, I woke up thinking in Tagalog, and my anxiety medication sat untouched because I'd forgotten what I was supposed to be anxious about. Maria's grandmother started calling me anak, which means child, and fed me foods my parents never made because they wanted us to be American. "You look like yourself now," my aunt said when I stopped straightening my hair and let my skin get dark from walking to the market every morning. The neighborhood kids found out I spoke English and begged me to teach them. Soon I had 20 students sitting on my aunt's porch learning words in exchange for guitar lessons and stories about their grandparents. The private school kids I used to know were posting about college admissions stress while I was teaching 7-year-olds to read English books under mango trees. Then Stanford emailed saying they'd hold my spot if I could return by fall with proof I could pay. Dad had found online work and saved enough for a plane ticket and 1 semester. But I'd already started teaching at the elementary school where kids walked barefoot for 2 hours to learn English from someone who understood being caught between worlds. "This is temporary," my mother said, watching me prepare lessons by candlelight during brownouts. "You belong in America getting a real degree." But I'd never felt more real than when Isabella finally read her first English sentence, and her mother cried with joy. The principal offered me a permanent position that paid almost nothing, but came with something Stanford couldn't give me. "I'm staying," I told my parents over breakfast, and my mother dropped her coffee cup while my father's face went dark. "We didn't lose everything just so you could waste your life here," he said. But I explained I wasn't wasting anything, just using it differently. The next morning, I was teaching colors when an American man in a suit entered my classroom holding official-looking papers. "You're working illegally on a tourist visa," he announced while my students stared confused at the English words. "You have 72 hours to leave or face permanent banishment from the United States." I tried explaining I was an American citizen, but he laughed. "Your passport expired and your parents never registered your birth with the Philippine consulate, so legally you're stateless." My parents had left for Manila that morning for interviews and wouldn't be back for days. "The embassy knows you've been working without permits and they're revoking your citizenship application," he said, smiling. "An American immigrant taking jobs from locals, and now you can never go back." I knew I had a life-changing choice to make. I stand frozen at the front of my classroom while my students stare at the American man in confusion, and I realize I need to get him out of here before this gets worse. My hands shake as I grab the papers he shoved at me, and I ask Georgina to please take over my class. She nods quickly, and I follow him outside into the hot afternoon air where other teachers are watching from their classroom doors. We walk to the principal's office, and I can feel sweat running down my back that has nothing to do with the heat. In Georgina's small office, I sit down hard in a plastic chair and read through the documents more carefully. They're covered in official stamps and legal words I barely understand, like overstay penalties and visa violations and exclusion orders. The man sits across from me and explains in a flat voice that I've been working illegally because my tourist visa expired 3 months ago. He says I'm subject to fines and possible exclusion from returning to the US, though his earlier threat about permanent banishment sounds more extreme now that he's being specific. I try to explain that I didn't know about the visa expiration and that I'm an American citizen, but he just taps the papers and says, "It doesn't matter what I thought." He leaves after making me sign something acknowledging I received the notice, and the office feels too quiet after he's gone. Georgina comes in a few minutes later and closes the door behind her. Her face looks worried but kind as she tells me I need to stop teaching immediately until this gets sorted out. She says she'll tell the students I'm taking a few days off for family reasons, and I feel my face get hot with shame that my mess is disrupting their education. I walk back to my aunt's house in a daze, and the neighborhood looks different now, like I'm seeing it through a screen. At the kitchen table, I try calling my parents in Manila where they went for job interviews, but both their phones go straight to voicemail. I'm left sitting there feeling completely alone while my aunt moves around making tea. She brings me a cup and asks what happened, but I'm too overwhelmed to explain the full situation clearly. I just keep saying I have visa problems and might have to leave, and she pats my hand looking confused. That evening, Maria shows up after I text her that something bad happened. She takes one look at my face and immediately pulls out her phone to call a friend whose sister works at a legal aid clinic. Within an hour, she set up an appointment for me tomorrow morning, and I feel grateful, but also embarrassed that I need this kind of help. Maria stays while I try to eat the dinner my aunt made, but everything tastes like paper. That night, I can't sleep, so I spread every document I have across my bed. My expired US passport with my serious 12-year-old face staring out. Old report cards from Sacramento schools with straight A grades that don't mean anything here. My Stanford acceptance letter that feels like it belongs to a different person. Test scores and recommendation letters, and my high school diploma still in its fake leather folder. My aunt comes in around midnight and digs out a box of papers from when we first arrived. She pulls out immigration forms my parents filled out and old receipts and a folder of documents with official seals. We go through everything together, but nothing clearly establishes my citizenship status or explains why my parents never registered my birth properly. Around 3 in the morning, I open my laptop and write an email to Stanford's admissions office. I try to sound calm and professional, explaining that I'm dealing with an unexpected immigration issue and asking if they can defer my enrollment while I sort this out. But my hands shake on the keyboard, and I'm terrified they'll just give my spot to someone else who doesn't have my problems. I hit send before I can overthink it, and then stare at the screen wondering if I just gave up my future. The next morning, I'm sitting in my aunt's kitchen drinking terrible instant coffee when I hear voices outside. Kids from my class are standing on the porch asking when I'm coming back to the school. Their worried faces make me feel even worse than I already do. My aunt goes out and tells them I'm sick and will return soon, but I can see through the window that they don't quite believe her. I hate lying to them, but I don't know what else to do. At the legal clinic, Maria and I sit in a waiting room with cracked plastic chairs and a fan that barely moves the hot air. When they call my name, I follow a woman down a narrow hallway to a small office crammed with file boxes. Eloisa is a sharp-eyed attorney in her 40s who's seen cases like mine before. She has short gray hair and wears a faded dress and gestures for me to sit in the chair across from her desk. She listens carefully as I explain the whole situation, starting from when the man showed up in my classroom. She takes notes in a spiral notebook and occasionally asks questions about my parents' immigration history and when exactly I arrived in the country. Her questions are specific, and I realize she's building a timeline in her head of everything that went wrong. When I finish talking, she sits back and taps her pen against her notebook. She explains I'm facing 2 separate problems that are connected but need different solutions. My expired tourist visa in the Philippines is one issue, and my unclear U.S. citizenship status is another. She says we need to tackle both at the same time because they affect each other. The Philippine issue is more urgent because I'm physically here and they can detain or deport me. But the U.S. question affects my long-term options for everything, including whether I can ever go back. She starts making a list of documents we need to gather and offices we need to visit, and I feel the weight of bureaucracy settling on my shoulders like a heavy blanket. Eloisa hands me a folder with blank forms and tells me to fill out everything I can about my birth and my parents' immigration history. She says we need to gather every document I have, even things that seem useless like old school IDs or vaccination records, because sometimes the smallest paper trail can prove residency or identity. I walk out of the clinic into the afternoon heat feeling like I'm carrying a weight I can't put down, and Maria walks beside me quiet for once because she knows I need to think. Back at my aunt's house, I spread all the forms across the kitchen table and start filling them out with shaky handwriting. 3 days go by where I stay inside and avoid the school, jumping every time someone knocks on the door. On the 3rd day, I'm eating lunch when my aunt's phone rings and it's Georgina saying someone from immigration is at the school asking for me. My stomach drops and I grab my folder of documents and run the 6 blocks to the school in the midday sun. Alfred is waiting in the principal's office, a thin man in his 30s with wire glasses and a government ID badge clipped to his belt. He introduces himself politely and says he's here to deliver an official notice about my visa status, not to arrest me or cause problems. Georgina sits next to me while he explains I have 30 days from today to either fix my legal status or leave the country voluntarily. He hands me a stack of forms that look similar to the ones Eloisa gave me, but with different headers and stamps. His voice stays calm and professional the whole time, like he's done this conversation 100 times before, and knows it's scary for people, but he's just doing his job. I ask him what happens if I can't fix everything in 30 days, and he says there would be fines and possibly a ban on returning to the Philippines for several years. After he leaves, I sit in Georgina's office staring at the forms while she makes tea neither of us drinks. That afternoon, I call the U.S. Embassy in Manila and navigate through their automated phone system for 20 minutes before reaching a real person. The appointment scheduler tells me the earliest available slot for citizenship questions is 9 days away on a Tuesday morning, and I take it even though 9 days feels like forever when I only have 30 total. I write the date and time on 3 different pieces of paper so I won't forget. The next morning, I wake up to an email from Teresa at Stanford's admissions office. She says they received my message about the immigration issues and she's sorry I'm going through this. The email explains they can hold my spot for 1 semester, meaning until January, if I can prove I'm eligible for financial aid and can return by then. After January, they'll need to offer the spot to someone on the wait list because they have policies about deferred admissions. Her tone is kind but firm, and I can tell she's trying to be helpful within rules she didn't make. I read the email 3 times and then close my laptop because I don't know how to respond when I can't promise anything about January. My aunt finds me sitting on the porch and suggests we start looking for my birth certificate from California, since that might help with both the US and Philippine governments. We spend the rest of that day and all of the next calling hospitals in Sacramento where I might have been born. The first 2 hospitals have no record of me at all. The third hospital transfers us between 4 different departments before someone in medical records says they found a notation in their old system. The woman on the phone explains their original paper documents were lost during a records consolidation project 5 years ago, but they have a digital entry showing a baby girl born to my parents on my birthday. She can send us a letter confirming the digital record exists, but she can't provide an official birth certificate without the original documents. My aunt thanks her and writes down everything she said while I feel my hopes sink, because a letter about a digital notation doesn't sound like enough proof for anything. That night, the power goes out again during another brownout, and my aunt lights candles around the kitchen. I sit at the table with my lesson plan spread out, writing vocabulary lists and math problems for my students by candlelight. Planning the lessons makes me feel calmer, like I'm doing something useful instead of just worrying. But it also makes me sadder because I keep thinking about how I might not get to teach these lessons to anyone. I write out a whole week's worth of activities for teaching the days of the week and months of the year, even though I don't know if I'll be here next week. The candle wax drips onto the edge of my notebook, and I watch it harden into little white pools. The next afternoon, Maria shows up with 3 other teenagers from our friend group, kids who've been hanging around during my porch classes. She announces they're going to keep teaching the neighborhood kids while I stay inside to follow the rules from immigration. I try to argue that they don't need to do this, but Maria cuts me off and says the kids need to keep learning and she already made a schedule. For the next hour, I watch through the window as they set up on my aunt's porch with the books and materials I've been using. Maria leads a reading group while the other teens help younger kids sound out words. I feel grateful that the teaching will continue, but also useless sitting inside while they do the work I started. One of the little girls keeps looking at the window like she's trying to see if I'm really in there. Tuesday morning comes and my aunt and I take a bus to Manila for my embassy appointment. The bus is crowded and hot and takes 2 hours through traffic. The embassy building is huge and white with American flags and armed guards at the entrance. We go through security where they check our bags and IDs, then wait in a lobby with hard plastic chairs for 40 minutes past my appointment time. Finally, someone calls my name and leads me to a small office where Vincent sits behind a desk covered in file folders. He's an older American man with gray hair and reading glasses, wearing a short-sleeve button-up shirt. I hand him all my documents and he reviews them carefully, making notes on a yellow pad. After about 10 minutes, he looks up and delivers the news in a straightforward way. He explains my parents' failure to register my birth with the Philippine consulate when I was born means I was never formally recognized as a U.S. citizen abroad. The man who threatened me about permanent banishment was exaggerating because I was never officially a citizen to begin with under their records. But this also means I don't have the protections or rights I thought I had as an American. My hands start shaking and I grip the edge of his desk to steady myself. Vincent keeps talking in the same calm voice, saying there might be a path forward where I could eventually apply for a student visa to return to the U.S. for college. But it would require proving my family has enough money to support me and strong ties to the Philippines to show I won't overstay the visa. He lists the requirements and they sound overwhelming. Bank statements showing thousands of dollars and property ownership and employment letters. I know my family doesn't have that kind of money or assets. He prints out an information sheet about student visas and hands it across the desk, then wishes me good luck in a tone that suggests he doesn't think I'll qualify. Walking out of the embassy into the Manila heat, I feel strange, like the bad news somehow made things clearer. At least now I know what I'm actually dealing with instead of living in confusion about my status. On the bus ride home, I stare out the window at the crowded streets and make a decision. That evening, I tell my aunt I'm going to focus on building a legal life here in the Philippines, rather than chasing after a U.S. citizenship that might never be real. She nods and squeezes my hand. The next morning, I go back to Eloise's office with all the documents I've gathered, including the letter from the Sacramento hospital and the information from Vincent. She reviews everything and says we should file paperwork requesting temporary permission for me to work as a volunteer or supervised helper, while we pursue formal recognition of my Philippine citizenship through my parents. She warns me the process could take months and there's no promise it will work, but it's the best option we have right now. I sign the forms she prepares and watch her make copies of all my documents. She says she'll file everything this week and we should hear back from the Bureau of Immigration within a month about the temporary status. Walking home, I feel the weight on my shoulders shift slightly. Not lighter exactly, but more like I know what I'm carrying now. That weekend, Maria shows up at my aunt's house with 3 other friends carrying bags of ingredients and a folding table. She announces they're organizing a fundraiser at the market tomorrow to help with my legal fees, and I need to stop arguing about it. They spend the afternoon cooking lumpia and packing them into containers while I sit at the kitchen table feeling useless and ashamed. My aunt makes bibinka and her famous coconut rice cakes that people always buy out at church sales. By evening, the kitchen smells amazing, and the counter is covered with food containers, but I can barely look at any of it because accepting this help feels like admitting I failed. Maria finds me hiding in my room and sits down next to me on the bed. She reminds me that when her grandmother got sick last year, the whole neighborhood raised money for medicine, and nobody called it charity, they called it community. She says I've been teaching their kids for months without asking for anything, and now it's their turn to help, and if I refuse, I'm basically saying their support doesn't matter. The next morning at the market, we set up the table under a tarp, and people start buying food before we even finish arranging everything. Parents whose kids I've taught stop by and drop extra money in the donation jar. My aunt's friends from church show up with handmade crafts to sell and add the profits to our collection. By noon, we've raised enough to cover most of Eloise's fees and some of the immigration fines. I stand behind the table handing out food and accepting thanks from neighbors I barely know, and something tight in my chest starts to loosen. 3 days later, my phone finally rings with my father's number, and I answer it standing in my aunt's backyard. He starts yelling before I can even say hello, demanding to know why I left him 3 urgent voicemails and what kind of trouble I'm in now. I try explaining the legal situation calmly, but he cuts me off and says I need to leave the Philippines immediately and figure out the US situation from somewhere else. His voice gets louder as he insists I'm throwing away my future for playing teacher with kids who aren't even my responsibility. I feel my own anger rising, and I tell him these kids matter more than some college acceptance that was never really mine anyway. He says I'm being selfish and naive, and I don't understand what he sacrificed to give me opportunities. I snap back that maybe I don't want the opportunities he chose for me, and suddenly I'm yelling too about how he never asked what I actually wanted. He calls me ungrateful and I hang up on him, my hands shaking so hard I almost drop the phone. I sit down on the back steps and cry for the first time since this whole mess started, not because I regret what I said, but because I meant every word. 2 weeks pass before I hear from Alfred through an official email to the address on my compliance forms. He schedules my Bureau of Immigration interview for 3 weeks from the date of his message, attaching a list of documents I need to bring. The concrete deadline makes everything suddenly real in a way it wasn't before, like I've been floating in uncertainty, and now there's solid ground rushing up to meet me. I print out the email and the document list and go over them with Eloisa at her office. She marks which items we already have and which ones we still need to gather, her pen moving quickly across the page. The list includes proof of address, proof of financial support, letters from community members, and Georgina's formal statement about my work at the school. Eloisa says 3 weeks is tight but manageable if we stay organized, and she starts making notes about what we need to do each week. On the day of the interview, I put on the most professional clothes I own and meet Eloisa outside the Bureau of Immigration building in Manila. The office is crowded with people waiting on plastic chairs, and the air conditioning barely works. Alfred calls my name after an hour and leads us to a small room with a desk and 3 chairs. He's wearing a short-sleeve button-up and reading glasses, looking exactly like what he is, a government worker processing paperwork. He reviews my application for temporary status, while Eloisa sits next to me taking notes. Alfred explains the fines I'll need to pay for overstaying my tourist visa, listing amounts that make my stomach hurt even though the fundraiser money covers most of it. He's not mean about it, but he's not sympathetic either, just stating facts and following procedures. Somehow that's easier to handle than if he was angry or judging me. He says my application looks complete and he'll make his recommendation to his supervisor within 2 weeks. Back at the school, Georgina pulls me into her office and shows me the letter she wrote to the BI describing my role. She calls me a supervised educational paraprofessional, working under her direct oversight, helping with curriculum support and student mentoring. It's technically true since I do work under her supervision, and I'm not a licensed teacher, but it feels like we're bending the rules to make my situation sound more official than it is. She asks if the wording works, and I tell her it's perfect, even though I'm nervous about whether the immigration office will accept this version of what I've been doing. She prints 3 copies and signs them all with the school stamp, then hands them to me in an envelope. She says she believes in what I'm doing here and she'll support me however she can within the system's limits. The next week, I stop teaching formal classes at the school and switch to one-on-one tutoring sessions at my aunt's house. It feels safer legally since I'm not standing in front of a classroom anymore, just helping individual students with their homework and reading practice. But I can only fit 4 or 5 kids per afternoon before it gets too crowded, which means most of my students can't come. The kids who live far away or whose parents work during tutoring hours start falling behind, and I feel awful about creating this unequal access. Maria helps by taking some students herself and teaching them what I taught her, but it's not the same as having everyone together learning at the same pace. I watch through the window as kids who used to sit on the porch for lessons walk past the house heading home because there's no room for them today. During one tutoring session, Eloisa calls with bad news about my birth certificate search. The hospital where I was born in Sacramento closed 5 years ago, and their records got transferred to the county records office. But when the county searched their system, they found no birth certificate on file for me, just a notation that I existed in the old hospital records that got lost during the transfer. This dead end means we can't prove my US birth through normal channels like we hoped. Eloisa says we need to try a different approach entirely because this path isn't going anywhere. I thank her and hang up, then sit at the kitchen table staring at my students' workbooks without seeing them. My aunt asks what's wrong, and I explain that I basically don't exist on paper in either country. The next day, Eloisa calls again with a new plan. She wants to pursue delayed birth registration in the Philippines based on my parents' Philippine citizenship and their testimony about my birth. It's complicated and requires multiple affidavits from people who knew my parents when I was born, plus supporting documents proving their identities and relationship to me. She warns me the process could take months, and there's no guarantee it will work, but it might be our best shot at getting me legal status somewhere. She emails me a list of what we need to gather, including affidavits from relatives, my parents' marriage certificate, their old Philippine passports, and any documents showing they were in California when I was born. I print the list and start making phone calls to relatives asking if they remember anything about my birth or have old letters from that time. My aunt comes through with a lead after talking to her sister in Pampanga. She remembers that a midwife from their hometown helped deliver me at the California hospital because my mother wanted someone who spoke Tagalog. The midwife retired back to the Philippines years ago and lives in a province about 3 hours away. My aunt gets her phone number through a cousin, and I call her nervously, not sure if she'll even remember my mother after all these years. But when I explain who I am, she immediately recalls my mother and says she remembers the birth because I came 2 weeks early, and my mother was scared. She agrees to write an affidavit about my birth and says she still has some old papers from her time working in California that might help. I feel a rush of relief that something is finally going our way. When I ask about meeting in person to get the affidavit notarized, the midwife explains she'll need payment to cover her time and transportation to the notary office in her town. She quotes an amount that's reasonable for a half day of her time plus travel costs, but it means using a chunk of money from the community fundraiser. I sit with the phone in my hand after we hang up, trying to figure out if this is a proper use of the money people donated or if I'm taking advantage of their kindness. The fundraiser was specifically for legal fees, and this is technically part of the legal process, but it also feels different from paying Eloisa or the immigration office. I talk it over with my aunt, and she says the midwife's testimony could be the key to everything, so the expense makes sense. But I still feel uncomfortable about it when I send the payment through a remittance service the next morning. The midwife's affidavit arrives by courier 3 days later, and I open the envelope carefully, reading through her statement about being present at my birth in Sacramento. My cousin walks into the kitchen while I'm reviewing it and asks what all the family fuss is about, her voice sharper than usual. I explain I'm trying to get my birth registered legally, and she crosses her arms. She says I'm getting so much family help when I chose to abandon America and come back here like it was some adventure. The words sting, and I try to explain it wasn't a choice, but she cuts me off. She talks about how our grandparents pushed our parents to emigrate and become American to escape poverty, how they sacrificed everything so the next generation could have opportunities. My staying here feels like I'm rejecting all that sacrifice and throwing it back in their faces. We end up yelling at each other across my aunt's kitchen table, her face red and my hands shaking. She says I got to grow up in California with good schools and college options, while she was stuck here with nothing, and now I'm acting like this place is some paradise. I yell back that I didn't ask to be born in America, and I'm just trying to survive a situation my parents created. We both go quiet after that, breathing hard and not looking at each other. My aunt comes in and tells us to calm down, her voice firm. My cousin sits down heavily and puts her head in her hands. She admits quietly that she's jealous I got opportunities she never had, that she watches kids from her neighborhood drop out of school to work while I got to be valedictorian. I sit down too, and we're both just tired. Then she surprises me by getting up and going to her room, coming back with a shoebox full of old letters and photos. She puts it on the table between us and says these are from my parents' early years in America, stuff her mom saved. The letters have dates and locations, and some of them mention me as a baby. She slides the box toward me and says, maybe they'll help prove when I was born. I thank her and she just nods, then leaves the kitchen without saying anything else. I spend the rest of the afternoon going through the letters, finding ones where my mom wrote to relatives about being pregnant, and then about my birth. There are photos too, with dates written on the back, showing my parents holding me as a newborn in front of their California apartment. These documents could actually help establish my birth timeline if Eloisa can use them. That evening, I get an email from Teresa at Stanford with a firm deadline. She says I have until the end of the month to confirm my enrollment and financial aid status, or they'll move forward with their waitlist. The timeline doesn't match up with my legal situation at all since I'm still waiting on basic documentation. I stare at the email for a long time and feel the American option slipping away like water through my fingers. The next morning, Vincent sends me a detailed checklist of everything I'd need to apply for a U.S. student visa later, including bank statements showing financial resources and proof of property or family ties here. I print out the list and go through it with my aunt, checking off what we have. We don't have property, and the bank statements show almost nothing after all the legal fees. My family doesn't have anywhere near the money or assets the visa office would want to see. I fold up the list and put it in a drawer, knowing that path is basically closed unless something major changes. 2 days later, I get a letter from the civil registrar's office rejecting my delayed birth registration application. The reason is that one of the documents has my name spelled slightly different from the others, with my middle name listed as Marie on some papers and Maria on others. It's a tiny thing that probably happened because someone wrote it down wrong years ago, but apparently it's enough to hold up the entire process. I want to scream at the unfairness of it all. How one small spelling mistake from decades ago can mess up my whole life now. I call Eloisa and she sighs when I tell her, saying this kind of thing happens all the time in Philippine bureaucracy. That night my aunt is washing dishes when she suddenly stops and turns to me. She remembers I was baptized at a church in Sacramento when I was a few months old because my parents wanted a Filipino priest to do it. She thinks a baptism certificate might serve as extra proof of my birth since it would have the date and location. We find the church's email address online and I write to them explaining the situation. They respond the next day with a scanned copy of my baptism certificate showing I was baptized there when I was 3 months old. But when I look closely, I see it also has the spelling variation that's causing problems, listing my middle name as Marie instead of Maria. I forward it to Eloisa anyway since it's still proof of my existence, and she says she'll figure out how to work with it. Eloisa spends the next week drafting sworn affidavits explaining the name spelling thing, getting statements from my parents and my aunt about how the variation happened. She has everything notarized and resubmits the whole package to the civil registrar with additional fees. I'm running out of money and patience, but she tells me this kind of back and forth is normal, that government offices here always find something to question. I pay the new fees using the last of the fundraiser money, and hope this is the final round. My father comes back from Manila 3 days later without a job offer, and the whole house feels tense. He sits at the kitchen table looking defeated, and I try to stay out of his way. But that evening he starts in on me about wasting my time here when I should be finding a way back to America. I tell him I'm doing the best I can with a bad situation, and he says I created the bad situation by choosing to stay and teach. We end up having an explosive argument right there in my aunt's kitchen with him accusing me of being selfish and throwing away everything he sacrificed for. He's crying and yelling at the same time, his face wet with tears while he shouts about how we lost everything so I could have opportunities. I yell back that I didn't ask him to sacrifice anything, and he can't control my whole life. My aunt tries to calm us down, but we're both too angry. I realize his anger is really about his own sense of failing to provide for us, that he feels like he destroyed the family by losing his job and forcing us here. Later that night, after everyone's gone to bed, my mother knocks on my door quietly. She comes in and sits on the edge of my bed in the dark. She admits she pushed us to be more American because she was scared we'd face the same poverty and limited options she grew up with here. She says she wanted us to have easier lives than she had, lives where we didn't have to worry about money or opportunities. Then she pulls out an envelope with cash inside, her small savings from years of putting aside grocery money. She offers it to help with the legal fees, and we both start crying, hugging each other for the first time since I was little. I take the money even though I know she needs it, because refusing would hurt her more. The next morning I'm walking through the market buying vegetables when one of my students' mothers stops me. She thanks me loudly in front of other vendors for teaching her daughter to read, saying it's changed their whole family's future because now her daughter can help the younger kids with homework. Other people in the market turn to look, and some of them nod at me with respect. The mother keeps talking about how her daughter reads everything now, street signs and product labels and church bulletins. Her gratitude reminds me that this work has real value, even if it doesn't come with a Stanford degree, and I feel my resolve strengthen to keep fighting for the right to stay here and teach. 2 days later, Alfred's email arrives with an official Bureau of Immigration letterhead attached, and my hands shake reading the subject line that says, Final Compliance Notice. The hearing is scheduled for exactly 2 weeks from today at the main BI office in Manila, and he writes in formal language that failure to present complete documentation could result in an exclusion order barring me from the Philippines for up to 10 years. I read the words exclusion order 3 times trying to understand what that actually means for my life here. The email lists everything I need to bring, including my passport, birth documents, school letters, barangay clearance, and proof of legal residence, and each item feels like another test I might fail. I forward the email to Eloisa immediately, and she calls me within an hour saying we need to meet tomorrow to review everything. That night I can't sleep, so I open my laptop and start searching what happens if I just leave the Philippines and come back to reset my visa status. The search results talk about overstay penalties and immigration violations that follow you across borders, and I realize there's no easy escape from bureaucratic mistakes. I find a forum where someone describes being banned from returning after trying to reset their status with violations on record, and their story sounds exactly like mine. The next morning, I show Eloisa my research, and she shakes her head saying that leaving now would make everything worse because the BI already has my file flagged. She explains that immigration databases share information, and any attempt to re-enter would trigger alerts about my previous violations, making it nearly impossible to return legally. I feel trapped by decisions I didn't even know I was making when I started teaching here. Eloisa spreads out all my documents on her desk, and we spend 2 hours going through each one checking for problems or missing signatures. She drafts a letter explaining my situation and emphasizing my community contributions, but her face looks worried when she reviews the thin stack of papers we have. I ask what happens if the hearing doesn't go well, and she says honestly that I could be required to leave within 30 days. Walking back to my aunt's house, I feel panic rising in my chest, thinking about having to abandon my students mid-year. Georgina calls that afternoon and asks me to come by the school to discuss something important. When I arrive, she's sitting in her office with a notepad covered in crossed-out phrases and rewritten sentences. She says she's been thinking about how to describe my role in a way that gives me more legal flexibility, and she suggests we stop calling it teaching. Instead, we reframe everything as facilitating a community learning center, where I coordinate volunteers and develop curriculum materials rather than providing direct instruction. I don't fully understand the difference, but she explains that volunteer coordinators face different regulations than teachers, and it might help my case. We spend the next hour drafting a new description of my work that emphasizes support and coordination instead of classroom teaching. She writes that I assist qualified teachers, develop supplementary materials, and organize community education activities under direct school supervision. The description feels like we're playing word games with the truth, but Georgina insists this is how bureaucracy works, and we need to present my role in the most favorable legal terms possible. She prints the letter on official school letterhead and signs it as principal, then puts it in an envelope for me to bring to the hearing. Before I leave, she mentions that the barangay captain has been asking about me because several families told him about the reading program. She suggests I should meet with him to request a formal endorsement letter supporting my community work. The next day, I walk to the barangay hall feeling nervous about asking a government official for help when I'm already in trouble with immigration. The captain is an older man with gray hair who listens carefully while I explain my situation and show him Georgina's letter. He asks about my students, and I tell him about Isabella learning to read, and the weekend program we started on my aunt's porch. He nods slowly and says 3 families came to him last week, praising the English lessons their children are receiving. He picks up a pen and starts writing an endorsement letter right there, saying that my educational contributions benefit the community and deserve official recognition. His support feels significant, like I'm building real roots here instead of just passing through. He signs the letter and stamps it with the barangay seal and tells me to bring it to my hearing as proof that local government recognizes my value. 2 weeks pass in a blur of organizing documents and practicing what to say at the hearing. The morning of the appointment, I dress carefully in clothes that look professional but not too American, and my aunt makes me eat breakfast even though my stomach feels tight. The BI office in Manila is a concrete building with long lines of people waiting outside, and I find Alfred's name on a directory board pointing to the 3rd floor. Eloisa meets me in the lobby, and we ride the elevator up together, while she reminds me to stay calm and let her do most of the talking. Alfred's office is small with filing cabinets lining the walls, and he gestures for us to sit in plastic chairs across from his desk. He reviews my documents one by one, asking questions about dates and signatures while taking notes on a form. Eloisa presents her arguments about my community contributions and hands him the letters from Georgina and the barangay captain. He reads both letters carefully without showing any reaction on his face. Then he opens my file on his computer and types something while Eloisa and I sit in silence waiting. After what feels like forever, he looks up and says that based on the barangay endorsement and school letter, he can approve conditional compliance status, while my citizenship application processes through the civil registrar. The fines for overstaying my visa are being reduced because of my cooperation and community integration, but I'll need to pay them within 30 days. He explains I can stay legally as long as I follow strict reporting requirements, including monthly check-ins at the local BI office and immediate notification of any address changes. Relief floods through me so strongly I almost cry right there in his office, but I manage to just nod and say thank you. Eloisa shakes Alfred's hand, and we walk out into the hallway, where I finally let myself breathe normally again. On the bus ride home, I call my parents and tell them the news, and there's a long silence before my father speaks. He says they'll help pay the reduced fines, but only if I seriously explore enrolling in a local education degree program instead of fixating on Stanford. His condition feels both like support and like giving up on the dream that brought us to America in the first place. But I need their help, so I agree to visit the university program and at least see what it offers. My mother gets on the phone and her voice sounds tired when she says they just want me to have a stable future and formal credentials. The next week, I take a jeepney to the State University campus and find the education department in a building with peeling paint and crowded hallways. The program coordinator is a woman in her 50s who shows me the course catalog and explains they offer a part-time bachelor's degree in elementary education. I expect to feel disappointed looking at the simple classroom and outdated textbooks, but instead I find myself interested in the coursework about child development and teaching methods. The classes focus on practical skills for Philippine classrooms rather than theory and testing, and I realize this program might actually be more relevant to the work I'm already doing than Stanford ever was. The coordinator says the program is affordable compared to American universities and designed for working adults, which means I could study while continuing to teach. Walking around campus, I start imagining myself as a student here, learning alongside other Filipino teachers instead of competing with overachievers at Stanford. It feels like a real path forward, instead of chasing an impossible dream. That evening, Teresa's email arrives with the subject line, "Final Decision on Enrollment Deferral." She writes that Stanford can't hold my spot any longer, and they're moving forward with their waitlist, wishing me well in my future endeavors. I read it sitting on my aunt's porch while kids play in the street, and I feel grief for the dream I'm losing, mixed with strange relief that the decision is finally made. The choice has been taken out of my hands, and I don't have to keep wondering what if anymore. I save the email in a folder labeled Past Life and close my laptop. That evening, I take a long walk through the neighborhood, passing houses where families are eating dinner and kids are doing homework under dim lights. For the first time, I let myself think about my identity not as American or Filipino, but as both at once existing in the space between two cultures. I don't have to choose one or reject the other or prove myself to either side. I can build something new that honors both parts of who I am without apologizing for being caught in the middle. The sunset turns the sky orange and pink while I walk, and I feel something settle inside me, like I've finally stopped fighting against where I am. 3 days later, a letter arrives from the civil registrar with an official seal, and I open it carefully, expecting another rejection. Instead, there's a Philippine birth certificate with my name spelled correctly and all the dates matching my parents' testimony. It's not a perfect solution since I still don't have U.S. citizenship, and probably never will, but it means I legally exist here in the Philippines. I can open a bank account and apply for jobs and register for university classes, and build a documented life. I hold the certificate up to the light, looking at the embossed seal, and my name printed in official typeface, and it feels more real than any acceptance letter from Stanford ever did. I take the birth certificate to Eloisa's office the next morning, and she photocopies it 3 times before starting the national ID application. She types my information into an online form while I sit across from her desk watching the ceiling fan spin and listening to traffic outside. The application asks for my address and employment status and references, and Eloisa lists my aunt's house and describes my role as educational volunteer under school supervision. She prints out a confirmation page with a reference number and hands me a flimsy paper document that says, "Temporary proof of application pending full ID processing." The paper is just regular printer stock with a stamped seal that looks like it could be easily faked, but Eloisa assures me it's legally valid for opening bank accounts and registering for university classes. I fold it carefully and put it in my bag next to my birth certificate, and walking out of her office, I feel lighter than I have in months. That afternoon, Georgina calls me into her office at the school and closes the door behind us. She pulls out a folder and opens it to show me a draft employment contract for the next school year starting in June. The position is listed as assistant teacher and educational paraprofessional, contingent on final approval of my work authorization from the district office. The salary makes me pause because it's barely more than what a fast food worker in California would make. But Georgina explains that's standard pay for beginning teachers here, and it comes with benefits. I read through the contract twice looking for problems or catches, but it seems straightforward and legitimate. She needs my signature by next week once I have copies of all my legal documents, and I promise to bring everything she needs. Walking home, I do the math in my head and realize the salary will cover basic living expenses if I'm careful, but there won't be much left over for savings or emergencies. Maria helps me organize a meeting with 6 teenagers from the neighborhood who've been helping with the porch classes. We gather at my aunt's house on Saturday morning, and I explain my idea for a structured peer tutoring program where they'd lead weekend sessions using the teaching methods I've been developing. At first, they look nervous about taking on that much responsibility, but I walk them through sample lesson plans and show them how to break down English grammar into simple steps. We spend 3 hours practicing teaching techniques, and I watch them gain confidence as they realize they already know more than they think. By the end of the session, they're excited and asking questions about curriculum and scheduling, and we agree to start the weekend program the following Saturday with 3 different class levels. I create folders for each of them with lesson materials and teaching notes, and seeing them take ownership of the program fills me with something close to pride. The first weekend session draws almost 40 kids because word spread through the neighborhood, and the teen tutors handle it better than I expected. They split the kids into groups by ability level and run activities I taught them while I circulate offering support. My father shows up halfway through without telling anyone he was coming, and I spot him standing at the back of my aunt's yard watching everything unfold. His face is unreadable and I brace for criticism, but he just observes quietly for 20 minutes. After the session ends and kids start leaving, he walks over and picks up a stack of chairs without saying anything. We fold chairs together in silence and pack materials into boxes, and his presence feels less angry than before. He doesn't apologize or praise the program, but helping without being asked feels like progress. Vincent's email arrives on Tuesday with the subject line Future Educational Pathways. He writes that if I maintain legal status here and complete a bachelor's degree at a Philippine university, I could potentially apply for a U.S. student visa in a few years for graduate school. He's careful to say it's not guaranteed and depends on many factors, including my academic record and financial resources, but it's a possibility worth knowing about. The email feels honest and realistic instead of making promises he can't keep, and I appreciate that he's giving me actual information rather than false hope. I save the email in a folder labeled Future Options and close my laptop. 2 weeks later, Alfred shows up at my aunt's house for a scheduled compliance check, and I have all my documents organized in a folder on the kitchen table. He reviews my temporary ID paper, my birth certificate, the school letter from Georgina, and my reporting logs from the past month. He seems satisfied and makes notes on his tablet, and his manner is almost friendly this time. He mentions that my case was more straightforward than many he handles because I cooperated fully, and didn't try to hide or make excuses. We talk for a few minutes about the bureaucratic process, and he explains that the system isn't designed to be cruel, it's just designed to process thousands of cases efficiently. I realize he's right, and that immigration enforcement is just a system doing what systems do, neither evil nor good, but just following rules. Before he leaves, he reminds me to keep reporting monthly and maintain all my documentation, and I promise I will. The scholarship notification comes in a thin envelope from the university, and I almost throw it away thinking it's junk mail. Inside is a letter saying I've been awarded a partial scholarship for the elementary education program based on my community teaching work and my academic record from California. The scholarship covers 60% of tuition, but I'll still need to pay for books and living expenses, which means I'll need to keep working. I read the letter 3 times to make sure I'm understanding it correctly, and then I call Maria to tell her the news. She screams so loud I have to hold the phone away from my ear, and she says we're celebrating tonight with her grandmother's cooking. The financial pressure isn't completely gone, but it's significantly reduced, and I feel like things are actually falling into place. My mother calls that evening to tell me she found an administrative job at a company in Manila, and my sister got accepted to a better high school there. They're moving next week and leaving my father and me at my aunt's house, and my mother sounds both excited and guilty about the family splitting up. I tell her it makes sense for them to be in Manila where the opportunities are better, and we talk about setting up monthly visits. My sister gets on the phone and complains about leaving her new friends here, but I can hear excitement in her voice about the Manila school. After we hang up, I sit on the porch thinking about how our family is spreading out geographically, but somehow communicating better than when we all lived in the same house. That Sunday, we have a family dinner at my aunt's house with my parents and sister before they move. The conversation is calmer than usual, and nobody brings up Stanford or America or what could have been. My father suggests we establish some ground rules for how we'll stay connected, and we spend an hour working out the details. We agree to see each other once a month rotating between Manila and here. We won't discuss past decisions or alternative paths, and everyone gets to make their own choices about where to live and work without judgment. My mother tears up a little but agrees, and my sister just wants to know if she can bring friends when she visits. It's not perfect harmony, and there's still tension under the surface, but it feels like functional peace. We eat my aunt's adobo and lumpia, and my father tells stories about his first years in America that I've never heard before. The next morning, my cousin finds me reading on the porch and asks if I want to help paint a mural on the community center wall. The barangay captain approved a project to brighten up the building, and she's been chosen to lead the design. We spend Saturday sketching ideas and mixing paint colors, and we create a design that combines Tagalog and English words with images of books and mango trees, and kids learning. Working beside her with paint on our hands and the sun beating down feels like we're both claiming this place as ours. She doesn't call me the American anymore, and I don't feel like a tourist. We're just 2 people painting a wall together in a neighborhood that belongs to both of us. The sky turned dark green on Tuesday afternoon, and the wind started bending the mango trees sideways. My aunt rushed around the house unplugging everything and filling buckets with water, while I helped her move furniture away from the windows. The storm hit around dinner time with rain so loud we couldn't hear each other talk and lightning that lit up the whole neighborhood every few seconds. The power went out within an hour, and we sat in darkness listening to the wind tear at the roof. My chest got tight and I felt the old panic starting to rise because everything suddenly felt unstable and out of control again. But my aunt handed me a flashlight and told me to help her cook rice on the gas stove for the neighbors who didn't have gas. We spent the next 2 hours preparing food by flashlight and carrying it to families on our street, and the work kept my hands busy enough that the panic couldn't take hold. The storm lasted through the night and all the next day with the power still out and no way to charge phones or get news. I gathered kids from the neighborhood on my aunt's covered porch and told them stories to keep them from getting scared while their parents dealt with leaks and broken windows. By the second night, when the storm finally passed and the power came back on, I realized I'd gotten through 2 days of chaos without touching my anxiety medication, and I'd done it by helping instead of hiding. The mail carrier brought a thick envelope 3 days later, and I knew what it was before I opened it. My Philippine national ID was a real plastic card with my photo and my legal name printed clearly, and an official seal that proved I existed here. I sat on the porch holding it and turning it over in my hands, and it felt more important than I expected. I still couldn't travel freely or return to the US without complicated visa processes, but I was officially recognized as a person in this country, and that mattered more than any theoretical future possibilities. My aunt came out and saw me holding the card, and she hugged me without saying anything, because we both understood what it meant. The school sent an email 2 weeks later saying there was a delay in processing my official teaching contract, because some administrator needed additional signatures, and the district office was backed up. I felt frustrated watching the weeks go by with no progress while I kept teaching under the temporary arrangement. Georgina called the district office 3 times pushing them to move my paperwork through, and she finally got someone to prioritize it by explaining how many students were counting on having a stable teacher. I learned that having someone who knew how to work the system was just as important as having the right documents, and I was grateful she was willing to fight for me. On Saturday, I taught my weekend class a lesson about the word home, and we talked about how it means bahay in Tagalog, but also means something bigger than just a building. The kids shared stories about what home felt like to them, and some said it was where their family gathered, and others said it was the neighborhood where they played. I explained that in English, people sometimes say they feel at home in a place even if they weren't born there, and we discussed how home could be a feeling and not just a location. The conversation mirrored everything I'd been learning about my own life, and I realized I was teaching them what I was still figuring out for myself. My parents showed up at the next class without warning and sat quietly in the back row while I led the students through their reading practice. Isabella stood up to read a full paragraph out loud, and she didn't stumble once, and when she finished, my mother had tears running down her face. After class ended, my father shook hands with several parents who thanked him for raising a daughter who cared about their kids, and my mother hugged Isabella's mom while they both cried. Nobody made speeches or talked about my choices, but something shifted in how my parents saw the work I was doing here, and I could feel it in the way they looked at me differently. I sat under the mango trees later that week watching my students practice their reading while the afternoon light came through the leaves in patches. I felt a deep sense that I was doing something that mattered, and it had nothing to do with having a famous school name or impressive credentials. This work was important because these specific kids were important, and I was exactly where I needed to be right now, even if it wasn't where I'd planned to be. An email came from a Stanford alumni group based in Manila saying they'd heard about my situation through some network I didn't know existed. They offered mentorship and networking opportunities for Filipino educators and made it clear they couldn't get me back to Stanford, but they wanted to support what I was building here. I appreciated that they saw value in the path I'd chosen without trying to pull me back toward the path I'd left behind, and I wrote back accepting their offer to connect. I spent an evening creating a 2-year plan for myself, using a notebook and a pen, and writing out concrete steps. I'd complete the local teaching degree program while working at the school, and I'd build up savings even if it was slow, and I'd maintain my legal status by following all the requirements. After 2 years, I'd reassess whether graduate school abroad made sense, or whether I wanted to keep growing roots here. It was a plan I was making for myself based on what I actually wanted, instead of following someone else's dream for me, and that felt powerful in a way nothing else had. The next weekend, I bought paint and brushes and repainted the sign for our weekend program, choosing words in both Tagalog and English that gave equal weight to both languages. I hung it on my aunt's porch where everyone walking by could see it, and the sign represented my choice to build a life here, while keeping doors open for whatever might come later. I was accepting that I could create something meaningful even within the limits I was living with, and that was enough for now. So yeah, that is pretty much it. Nothing too serious, just life doing its thing. Thanks for hanging out with me. It always feels easy and real when we do this. Catch you again if you drop by.